The fall 2025 season of Investigation with Dr. T is proudly centering on our institution's newly designated prestigious R1 Carnegie classification. We're seizing this moment to go deeper, think bigger, and highlight the game-changing work that's happening. So each episode this fall is going to spotlight cutting-edge research initiatives, groundbreaking studies, and powerful doctoral dissertations led by PhD and EDD students, research-engaged faculty, field-based research practitioners, and community partners. So we're going to focus on vital sectors like education, criminal justice, human services, while also welcoming special guests from the College of Psychology, College of Dental Medicine, and the College of Computing and Engineering. And join us as we celebrate our journey into R1 territory and explore what it truly means to lead with research, lead with scholarship, and lead with purpose. So stay tuned. Fall 2025 Investigation with Dr. T. It's going to be unforgettable. And tonight, I am so happy to welcome Dr. Tina Craddock and Dr. Maribel DelRio Roberts. And let me tell you a little bit about both of them. Dr. Craddock holds a BS and MS and PhD and a PhD in criminal justice, and she went to our school, yes, NSU, criminal justice PhD. She holds a master's in English literature, graduate certificates in security studies and forensic science, CSI. She's a full-time faculty member at Elizabeth City State University since August 2019. She currently serves now as the department chair for the Department of Social Sciences. She also received her tenure recently. Her research interests include gender-racial inequality, implicit bias in the criminal justice system, and the impact of critical incidents in law enforcement. And my colleague, Dr. Maribel DelRio Roberts, PsyD, is an associate professor within the Department of Human Services, and she oversees the Masters in Developmental Disabilities. She's also the supervisor of psychology trainees, practicum students, interns, postdoc residents, and Dr. DelRio Roberts is currently the principal investigator on a grant titled an analysis of the Watch Me Grow program for young children at risk or diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. We've worked a lot together, Dr. DelRio Roberts and I, and Dr. Tina Craddock and I will talk a little bit more about that as we get into what tonight's episode is going to be about. And so welcome everybody to the Investigation with Dr. T, the season that we're dealing with R1 and all of the research, and we're bragging on it and we're spotlighting it. Tonight, we take a solemn and deeply important look at the long-term impact of one of the most devastating school shootings in our nation's history, the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. 5 years later, what we've learned from the lived experiences of these young adult survivors, we're going to share with you tonight how their voices have guided the research and maybe can guide policy and maybe guide practice moving forward. So please help me welcome my two amazing colleagues, my guests, and I'm going to ask them to put their cameras on now, Dr. Tina Craddock and Dr. Maribel DelRio. And so, I just want to say a little, that was your bio, right? Those were your bios, but I just want to put a little human touch on this and say that Dr. Tina Craddock was my student, and I say that with the most humility and the most respect. I chaired her dissertation committee, and I've watched her blossom into an amazing academic, an amazing researcher, and we've worked together on other research that really Dr. Craddock led, and I just sort of followed along, and then asked her if she would join the research team for the Parkland study. I served as the PI. Dr. Maribel DelRio Roberts. I'll say something that I love. See, first of all, I love both of these women because they're not only brilliant and they're not only competent in what they do, but they're the most kindest, compassionate, loving people that I've ever known, really. And I went away with both of them. I went to Chicago with Tina, and when we did the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and we presented together. And then I went to Barcelona, Spain, with Dr. Maribel DelRio Roberts, and she adopted me. Her and her husband and her family, her two children, adopted me on the trip because I was alone. And we did tours together, and we ate dinner together, and the way they welcomed me as part of their family, I will never forget. But anyway, more about them and less about my experience. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And I'm so grateful that you're both here with me. And I'm so grateful that you both worked on this project. So, anything that you guys want to say before we get into the questions about the study itself?
Well, thank you for inviting us to be a part of this. So happy to be here. And, any opportunity to collaborate with Dr. T, I will definitely jump on that bandwagon, because I think our collaborations are always fruitful, they're impactful, and they're just so fulfilling and enriching. So thank you for always, valuing the work that we do. And I hope that we can continue, and especially to talk about such the impact of some of the research that we did,
Yes.
related to this topic. So
Great.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
And
Thank
I'll
you.
say, I continue to be your student. I was your student for some years, and I continue to be your student, and I continue to learn a lot about grace and humility from you. And I was honored and privileged to ask to be part of this research because it's so important and it's so relevant. I was just happy to have one small part in it. And I'm looking forward to maybe expanding that and doing some subsequent research studies that we've talked about, because it's always a joy to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ditto. So I'm going to start with Dr. Del Rio on this. I'm just going to ask you what your specific role was in conducting this study, and how do you feel it shaped, how did it shape the findings that we're discussing today?
Sure. So I served as one of the co-investigators on the project, and I basically contributed or helped to collaborate on both the design of the semi-structured interview, and the qualitative analysis process. In terms of developing and refining the interview guide and really trying to be sensitive, to eliciting the survivors' reflections of their experiences, not only taking into account before what their experiences were before, but during, and also the sensitivity of what they're experiencing now afterwards in the aftermath. And really trying to make sure that as a licensed psychologist and having that framework, being able to maintain that trauma informed approach, and making sure that we were sensitive to the fact that we were really having very difficult and painful conversations at times, being able to be attuned to the participants' verbal and nonverbal cues, and also being available to offer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but just being able to offer support during some of these interviews if needed, if there was distress or some sort of emotional reaction that really warranted a bit more follow up. So I think that that was really my most impactful part in the project, and also participating in some of that analysis of some of the interviews transcripts, and collaborating to really make sure that we were capturing the lived experiences of a participants, and keeping that in mind as well when we are reporting the findings.
Thank you. And Dr. Craddock, can you tell us a little bit about what your role was, and also maybe how it shaped the findings?
Sure. So initially, my role, I served as a literature reviewer. So I helped to gather some of the literature for the background. Um, and then I served in of a coding capacity. So once the interviews were completed, we started the process of coding, looking for recurring themes um, between participants so that we could see it's about perception. So we could see how this person perceived a specific thing. Was it similar to how another person perceived that specific incident or portion of their experience? So I worked on both sides, really. The literature gives you a really good foundational background, but the coding, which was not Dr. T's favorite thing to do because she's a qualitative researcher.
Quantitative is easier
He's a
for me.
quantitative researcher, and this was a qualitative study, or really a mixed method study because it has some data analysis in it.
That's
But
true.
I really did work more in reviewing the transcripts and the recordings of the participants, and then looking at coding.
Great. I want to bring up something, and I know it's not one of the questions that we had kind of agreed upon, but it's a softball question anyway. I think that when we talk about research and we talk about ethics and we talk about beneficence, right? The three major principles in the study of human subjects, of course, is justice and respect for persons, and then that beneficence piece, which is, hey, it's really great and a great benefit for us as researchers to find out these questions. What are the answers to our questions? Our questions are always great, but at what cost? At what cost to the participant? And so, there's this whole piece, especially when talking about trauma. As a 9/11, first responder and survivor, I don't like when people really just ask me questions about it. I want to be kind of in a place where I feel comfortable and safe to talk about it. But if somebody just kind of like starts asking me questions, especially researchers, it feels so just kind of like re-traumatizing, perhaps, right? It can be. So what do you both think about this in terms of good questions? What are the lived experiences? What are the perceptions of the survivors of the Parkland shooting 5 years later? What were their impressions of this? Those are great questions. But what about the ethical piece, and what about that beneficence? Who wants to take that?
Sure, I can start off on that with that. And I think, ethics obviously is the crux of this whole this whole project. And I think especially when we're undertaking something like this, and I think, really taking into account and having a conversation with the participants before we began the interviews and letting them know that if at any point they were felt uncomfortable, did not feel that they were able to continue, did not want to talk about a specific question or answer a specific question, that they had every right to voice that and that we would be respectful of that. And I think making sure that we were respectful of their boundaries and limits, and some participants, although it was painful for them, they were able to navigate and talk about some of these things. And we had participants that found it very challenging and difficult, and did have to take breaks. We did have to offer breaks. We did have to offer the opportunity to talk to a mental health professional. We did have to at times. And so, there were many ethical considerations. And I think in terms of the beneficence piece, I think for some of them, it was really the first chance they had to tell their story, their narrative. Now looking back and almost kind of replaying it, or being more further removed from that experience, without that sense of, we want anything from you other than we just want to know what that was like for you.
Right,
And
right.
being able to offer them that opportunity to talk about that impact and what they felt was done well and handled well, and what was not. I think
Right.
some of them, that was very cathartic.
Yes, and we also had these interviews took place on Zoom, and in the breakout room, waiting in the wings, if you will, were yourself, Dr. DelRio, and also Dr. Timothy Scala. He took some of the interviews, you took some of the interviews, and participants, if they needed to take a break with a mental health practitioner, we could put them in that breakout room, either at any time during the interview or certainly after the interview was over. I just wanted to point that out, that that was part of our design. Dr. Craddock, do you want to add anything about the ethics piece?
Um, sure. So something that I felt like we did really well was to be gentle, to not further harm, to not further victimize. And that was because of you. And I think the huge part of that, and the reason I say that is because you shared with them a traumatic experience that you went through. And I think having someone that they say, yeah, you really do understand. Whereas someone like me, I maybe haven't gone through that same kind of experience, they're not going to be as comfortable. And so I think you put them at ease by making sure they understood that you really did understand where they were coming from and the place they were coming from and the
Well,
place they were trying to get beyond, because that is your lived experience also.
Well, thank you for saying that. I had to be really careful though, because sometimes I was talking to Maribel constantly, and Dr. Maria Levy Minzy also was on this research team, and she was someone who handled a lot of the interviews. Dr. Brooke Elvington also did one interview, and Dr. Jennifer Allen was also a part of the research team. So I'm like that made up the whole research team that of all these folks that I just now mentioned. But I remember distinctly one particular interview where I was on the phone with Maribel for like, I don't know, it felt like an hour, and she was giving me a therapy session because even though I was able to, maybe identify or share my experience with them to put them at ease, it also was triggering me. And it just was, hearing the story, it really was challenging for me to kind of put on the researcher hat and not put on my minister hat, and not put on my first responder traumatized hat as well, right? So that was something that I kept on having to balance, and I got a lot of support from Dr. DelRio and Dr. Minzy as well. So Dr. DelRio, your research and this research focuses on the lived experience of these survivors. What themes, just off the top of your head, emerged most strongly in their reflection 5 years later?
There were a few. I think the one that stood out most prominently for me was that there was awareness of the shooter's troubling behavior prior to the event. So it was students were ultimately surprised and taken by surprise when it happened, but no one was surprised of who the perpetrator was. So this was someone who had been, expelled. This was someone who was consistently problematic. This was someone who was threatening to students. This was someone who, had consequences, and he was well known within the community that there were issues, and so no one was really surprised that this was the case, but it was surprising that it wasn't ever really effectively dealt with. There were really no substantial interventions or referrals made to address some of those concerning behaviors. So that was one of the major themes. Um, I think another one that really stood out was the confusion and the lack of preparedness during the interview, where, teachers, administrators, law enforcement, students, there was just a lot of students mistaking this situation for a drill. They had had a drill that morning, and so when it all transpired, they felt like they were fake actors, many of them, because they had just had a drill that morning. So that was also
Right.
interesting in terms of how that came up a lot. I think reliance on peer support, that was also at the top of the list, in the sense of what got these survivors through was leaning and supporting each other. It
Yes.
wasn't professional mental health, providers. It wasn't interventions or supports provided by the school or any other agency. It was their core group of friends. It was the other survivors. And that was really what that kept them resilient, and those connections, many of them remain, and those bonds that they formed really continue to this day, in terms of their reports, and they remain connected. And I think finally, one of the other themes that came up was the sense of re-traumatization and discomfort with the security measures implemented after the incident. So a lot of the participants felt that it was intrusive, that it was re-traumatizing, that it was a violation of their, almost felt like they were in prison to a certain extent, and it just didn't really help with the reintegration back into, the school. So I
Yes.
think those are the ones that really stood out most.
Yeah, and again, like putting it into my personal perspective, um, mental health practitioners, and this is said with all due respect and love and support and honor and respect for the mental health profession.
I got
But
it.
for me as a first responder and my police officers and sergeants that worked for me down there at Ground Zero and at the Family Assistance Center, turned off. Really, I was turned off. And I have a PhD in social work. I shouldn't be turned with a specialization in mental health, and yet as a survivor, I didn't want to deal with the mental health practitioners, even the clergy that was present, the spiritual care providers. No, I mean I identified with two different groups: the dogs, the therapy dogs, and of course other officers, my peers. That's who it worked for, and then that's what we heard them say. Dr. Craddock, do you want to add to this
I
part
can add,
about themes,
sure, I can add one other theme, and to me
please?
that came out is really was that the normal from February the 13th was not the new normal for February 15th. And the participants expressed frustration at school administrators and some family members with good intentions that said we want to work and get it back to normal as quickly as possible, but that definition of normal doesn't exist anymore for them, and so there needed to be a different definition of normal that they didn't get. And I think that was one of the recurring themes, was a bit of anger and frustration at the fact that everybody was trying to hurry them along in their process and get back to normal. But, you know, normal is subjective, and normal for school administrators is going to be significantly different than normal for these survivors that had just been in the thick of it.
Right, exactly. It's kind of like after 9/11. I want to say, like, what was it, like 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later? Maybe it was longer because it was probably October. So maybe it was like a month later, where we're in the middle of the World Series, and President Bush throws the ball out, and it's like get back to normal. And we heard the mayor of New York say, "Go out and shop, let's get back to normal." And for survivors, that's like, wow, that's that's not okay, because nothing is ever going to be the same.
Right.
So let me ask you, Dr. Del Rio, this question. How do you balance capturing the stories with honoring the trauma and sensitivity of the participants? How do you do that as a researcher?
I think first and foremost, carefully planning, and really thinking through some of those semi-structured interview questions. I think, going back to that piece of ethical sensitivity, that was really central, because they're really sharing those painful and very personal, deep experiences. So keeping in mind that trauma-informed approach, trying to make sure that if there were certain um, triggers or sensitivities that they vocalized, that we were aware of those, that we didn't push any further, and really making sure, aside from some of the things that I mentioned related to, that informed consent and making sure that they could, rescind their participation at any point in time in the research, that they were not obliged, and we did have, I think, a few, not a huge number, but a small number of participants that initially said they would participate and then decided not to. And I think part of that might have been because of, maybe they were fearful of being triggered in some way or rehashing their experiences. Having that mental health support available, even when Dr. Scala or myself were not the ones conducting the interview, but having one of us there. And I think what was great is that everyone on the research team was so sensitive. Everyone had that in mind to make sure that the participants' well-being comes first, regardless of, what agenda or what we were hoping to get out of it. There, if it's fruitful and we can get the information that we can share and disseminate with others, great. But if not, then that's okay too, right? And so really being mindful of that. And just really that participant autonomy. If they wanted to be on camera, they could. If they didn't want to be on camera, that was also their prerogative. And really just rather than making it kind of a very strict interview style, it was very conversational. And we really tried to establish rapport with the participants, make sure that they felt comfortable doing check-ins throughout to make sure they're feeling okay. And just, ensuring that they are only need to share whatever they feel comfortable sharing.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Craddock, from a social science perspective, how does this tragedy, the Parkland tragedy, connect to broader patterns of violence and community resilience?
Well, unfortunately, school shootings are becoming more commonplace. And my fear is that it will become more the norm and more people will become desensitized to it. So we have to make sure that we educate as good as we can educate our students, our communities, so that the conversations don't stop and stop being important. As a social scientist, we have an obligation to not further harm where we don't need to further harm, but it's really about keeping the conversations relevant and going, making sure that anyone that is willing to share their story is not further harmed, and that the stories are told and the voices are heard. I just think that's an obligation as a social scientist that we have, because our end goal really is to work towards changing policy. Hopefully, there seems to be a waxing and waning of public outcry. When there's a school shooting, you'll get a week or two of really hard at it public outcry, and then it will wane back because some other big story happens until the next school shooting happens. And that might be a week later, it might be a month later, but it happens. And so we need to keep the conversations going, keep the research going, because showing the research and showing what the data shows us is where we can make the change in policies. I tell my students, you are the future policymakers. And so you need to be educated. You need to be well-versed. You need to understand these things.
Yeah. And, it's funny that you're talking about, policy changes. One of the biggest themes, as Dr. DelRio was saying before, that emerged from the participants was that the school knew about all of this. This wasn't a secret, right? And yet, he still had the ability to come onto campus that day. So how does all of that happen? And there's so many things that fell through the cracks. And for, like we heard this right from the survivor. I had heard this before. We had heard about it in the news, through the trial, through the sentencing. We knew all about Nicholas Cruz and what was going on for him, and how everybody, all the administrators knew, and all the teachers knew, and all the counselors knew. Everybody knew. But when you hear it from the survivor, that's chilling.
It is.
And I really find it hard to forgive that's what's happening. Dr. DelRio, do you want to add a little something to that, or Dr. Craddock? Either one of you weigh in on what I just now said.
No, it is absolutely chilling, and we have found that not only with this particular case, but as you mentioned, in many of the shootings that have happened, there have been warning signs. There have been signs of things that have been ignored. And I think the other piece of this is collaborating with families. So a lot of times families are either unaware, so the schools are aware and everyone else is aware, and the families are not aware, or the families are aware and there isn't that understanding of the potential threat and implication that can come about as a result of this. And that's why accessibility to firearms that are unsecured and other things that are happening. And I don't know, again, that collaboration between the schools, the communities, and the families, and just more of that comprehensive multifaceted system of care that should be in place. But yes, it's just, it
Exactly.
is very chilling.
Exactly. And what was really interesting that came out of a lot of this study, this phenomenological study, was that it's not one thing. It's not about gun control. It's not about security and fostering a sense of security on a campus. It's not about any of those things. It's about a lot of those things. And as a person who does study mental health, I would say that it sounds like he was very troubled, and again, someone failed him. So they not only did the system and all of the systems fail the survivors and fail the victims who died, but also, failed him.
Mhm.
Dr. Craddock, Dr. DelRio, anything?
I have everything going in my head. I think one of the telling parts from the survivors and what they shared was that they had all had interactions with him, and the teachers had interactions with him, and the teachers had told the students to just ignore him, or essentially don't make eye contact and nothing will happen, or ignore him, or we just let him sit over on this side of the room and do whatever he wants. And so they were really empowering him to keep on with the bad behaviors. And yeah, all the students knew, and all the administrators and all the teachers, and yet there was nothing that was done.
And I think at the bottom of all of this too, I think it was almost attributed solely to some sort of conduct disorder, antisocial type of traits, which yes, there was some of that, but this was also an individual who had a genetic vulnerability to develop he developed certain neurodevelopmental, it seems, dispositions that made him even more vulnerable to that, right? And so his preoccupation with guns and murder, and there was a strong preoccupation there that you often tend to see in people that have hyper focused or hyper fixations. And so there were things that I think he was throughout his time in the system. I don't know that the interventions that were provided were the right interventions for him. And I think being conceptualized from a particular lens and not really fully being able to understand social context. In a lot of ways, just compounded a lot of the resentment and the rejection and the anger. And so then there was this whole lack of connection in terms of I'm just angry and I need to do something about this, right? And so I
Agreed.
think it was also that he was not the right support was not provided. If support was provided, it was not the right support that he needed.
Right. I just want to, I think that this is Dr. Elvington. I think so. It would be too coincidental that there would be someone named Brooke um, on the YouTube chat. But I do think that it's Dr. Elvington, and she is one of the researchers on this team on the Parkland study. And she says that she agrees there's always signs and definitely thinks that schools and families should have more communication with each other. And so that's a great lead in to the next question for you, Dr. Del Rio, about what can schools, universities, and communities learn from these survivors' stories to better prepare, to better respond, and to better mitigate.
I think first and foremost, early intervention and information sharing is really important. So, the fact that these survivors were reporting that there were problematic things, that the behaviors observed, the fact that there were expulsions from school that were reported. He was no longer even attending the school as a result of all of the issues that there had taken place. And still there was not a clear delineation or line of, okay, this particular person is a threat. So I think including or developing more formal threat assessment protocols when there are early warning signs rather than waiting for it to escalate when the behavior is an actual direct threat or has occurred, right? Early on, going through those early assessment and those early threat assessments is important. I think mental health centered prevention is also really important. So there's a lot of physical security measures that have been implemented since then in many schools and universities and, community events and things like that. But especially in schools, I think it's not only a sense of establishing physical safety, but also more of like that emotional safety as well.
Yes.
And having people and providers and professionals available to process and have someone come to them and say this person is a concern, and being able to have more consistent follow-up and more closely follow them, I think is really important.
Yes.
Trauma informed safety planning, that's also without re-traumatizing survivors. So having metal detectors and armed security guards. And yes, that creates a sense of visible safety, but it's not always a sense of felt safety. So including stakeholders, including other people in those conversations of what would, in part of our safety planning, what can be done that isn't re-traumatizing or triggering, right? And I think finally, what we learned most, I think what I learned the most was that peer-based community supports should always be available. So having peer-to-peer groups, whether it's survivor groups or peer-to-peer, just groups where they can go to if they're struggling with something, where they can just share and have those lived experiences with others that might also be going through challenges is, really really beneficial, not only
Yes.
to, it was to the survivors, but I think also in general, in terms of prevention and just establishing that resilience later on.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Craddock, if you could identify one critical gap in current support systems for survivors of school shootings, what would it be? And you can base that on the themes that emerged, survivors themselves.
One of the themes that came out from the survivors was the lack of trained trauma counselors Um, and they felt like the counselors that they were given access to were just as traumatized as they were. And so they weren't much help to them. Some didn't get counseling help until later because some of the participants, some of the survivors left the area soon after, and they were told they only had services as long as they were right there in the area. And some of them couldn't afford that, but to be effective immediately after a traumatic event like that, I think that it's really important to have specialized mental health counselors that have this specialized training in mass casualty or mass shooting or school shooting, um, to be there as quickly as possible, like boots on the ground as quickly as possible, um, because that was one of the concerns I think unilaterally they all mentioned was the lack of trained counselors that they could go to. So they turned to one another. And that was probably one of the most eye-opening parts of our research was how important their friend group was for getting each other onto the next days and weeks and months ahead.
Exactly, exactly. I'm going to move to a statement here that's being made by our very own Dr. Castro. And as an amazing researcher as he is, this is, and also mental health practitioner. I want to just read this statement to both of you and see what you think. So he says this idea may be unpopular, but a possibility. Could it be that the field of psychology doesn't know how to intervene when faced with events as extreme and traumatic as this one? Dr. DelRio, you want to weigh in on it?
Sure. I think that's an interesting point. I think that, as mental health practitioners, we're trained on in theories and we're trained depending on your philosophical preference to address certain presenting problems, right? Or issues. And there is trauma informed care and there's trauma informed practice. Um, and there's kind of a protocol or a guide in terms of how to implement that. Um, but is it going to work or be effective for every survivor? Absolutely not. And I think we need to move away and continue in the field of psychology and mental health to focus on more individualization, right? And so understanding that we have that as a framework, we have these skills and this knowledge to say, okay, maybe we can try to guide or support the survivor in a particular way, but that it's going to be different for every single survivor and to not and I think depending on, different factors, sometimes, as you mentioned, sometimes as clinicians, we can be triggered and we can impact and implement our own, biases. So, do I think we have certain tools? I think we have certain tools that might be effective for certain people, for certain survivors. Do I think we have all the answers? Absolutely not.
Okay,
I think trauma is so complex and it affects each individual so differently and how they cope and what they find useful that I think, it is something that in the field we need to be better at understanding.
great.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Here's another one from one of our PhD students. Security measures, and it's Jamie McCarthy. Security measures only go so far. But if the root of the problem is not addressed, and in parentheses, she writes, mental, it will never change. Taking the survivor's experiences into account for policy change is paramount. And so, Dr. Craddock, what do you think about that? I mean, we presented this at the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. We presented the research findings. We submitted to a journal, And as we know, I mean, peer-reviewed journals they're really difficult to get into, and so we're in the process of kind of brushing some stuff off and polishing, and we will resubmit. But how do we take the survivors' voices now as those who know, really in the know, and make change in policy? What do you think?
I think that's the only way policy will get changed. The only way. We can give them statistical data all day long. We can give policymakers, legislators, but it takes that experience. It takes that victim that's willing to step up and share their story, um, and share their experience and bring that human factor to a lot of data that doesn't have a human factor. I think that's the only way that change will happen, which is why I said we really have to promote the storytelling, the voices, because that's what's gonna at some point be loud enough for change to actually take place. And gun control is too big of an issue. But how many times have we seen mass shootings where there wasn't a mental health issue that went along with that? And
Right.
so that's why I say it's gonna take the voices, it's gonna take the researchers sharing the voices, sharing the stories like we did, like other researchers have done for other school shootings. It's gonna take that perpetual cycle of voices, and sadly new voices. I think that human factor is what is gonna put us over to have any kind of a policy change.
Good. Great. And you mentioned early on that it was really kind of a mixed method study because of the TSI. I'm saying that right, right? It was a trauma symptom inventory, and so that's quantitative. And what were the findings? Do we remember for the TSI piece? It was a majority of the participants met the criteria.
Um, so given that it was 5 years later, when they were completing the TSI, I don't think we saw as many elevations quantitatively as maybe we would have seen when it was more immediate. But one of the things we did see, I think, was a lot of avoidance. I think avoidance was the most prominent characteristic of trauma that they were still experiencing at this point. Some continued to have difficulties with sleep and re-experiencing and things like that. But I think what was most consistently observed, even 5 years later, was that avoidance of places, people, things that could potentially trigger that experience and that pain.
Yeah. I have it's 10 to the hour almost, and so I like to go to the questions that we're seeing, especially in the webinar. There's some like really great questions, and I can't get to all of them because we like to always end on time, start on time, end on time. It's the Catholic school in me that does that, right? So Christopher Robley, who is one of our PhD students, he asks a really great question. In what ways could the peer support model, which emerged as a key source of resilience in the study, be adapted or scaled to complement formal mental health services for individuals requiring more intensive therapeutic care? Who would like to take that one?
Um, I think it should be almost part of an evidence-based practice, to be honest with you. I think that, in multiple and many studies, and not only, our study, but what the literature shows is that those peer support groups are effective. And so not only does it help to have that individual, it complements because you have that individual time to process more in depth, but you also have that opportunity of that camaraderie to say, I'm not the only one. So it decreases that sense of of being alone, and kind of normalizes a little bit more of their feelings so that they don't feel so isolated, which positively impacts depression and anxiety, and decreases the likelihood of other mental health conditions from emerging. So I think that really should be the way forward and the trend. And I think they naturally complement each other. And I think practitioners that work in the field of trauma should really consider that and offer that as part of that trauma informed care, is to offer that individual piece, but also that group piece as well.
Excellent. Thank you. This is for Dr. Craddock from Josh Blotzer. He's a newer PhD candidate with us, and he asks a really great question. How can we influence policy changes when elected officials use the emotionally charged nature to disingenuously dismiss the effort as ill-timed when mass shootings are occurring on a daily or nearly daily basis? This creates a situation in which there will never be a right time to act. Regardless of any suggested policy changes, there are also individuals who will just ignore the concerns and evidence and dismiss the problem. And it's a mouthful, but Dr. Craddock, it was directed at you. What do you think?
That's a $1 million question, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
How do we make policy change? And in the political climate that we're in now, everything is politicized. So I don't have a really great answer for that. My answer for making policy change is to continue to have that voice, continue to tell the stories, continue to do the research, continue to do the publications. The school shootings are going to continue to happen, and I don't see an end to that. They do happen daily, and I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I keep trudging forward with hope and faith that at some point we're going to reach that point where it's enough for policy to change. That it's just a hard question to answer. It's just because
Right.
I don't know where's the line in the sand where when we hit this threshold, policy will change.
Well, when you want to talk about politics for a minute, so these findings kind of indicate that administrators failed, mental health systems failed, parents may have even failed in some ways. Well, I don't know what journal you can submit to, because that's kind of a black eye yeah, to the profession of those individuals that I just mentioned, those groups.
Yeah.
So how do you get in front of legislators? How do you get in front of school administrators? How do you get administrators to listen and hear that that going to the security measures that they went to after the shooting was re-traumatizing and was not helpful. And then, in fact, survivors had mentioned in some of their interviews that they felt like they were the ones who were being targeted now as a result of the clear backpacks and all of that other stuff that was going on. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you think? How do you get in front of the policymakers so that they could not be on the defensive, and then they could hear, right from the horse's mouth kind of thing? Like, what? So what? Like, what? How do we make change? Which one of you wants to wrap that up?
I mean, my 2 cents on that is, I think you have to get in front of the players that they care about. So you have to go through the companies, you have to go through people that make a difference that they listen to. So where the money is, unfortunately. And I feel like having stronger lobby groups that will go out there, and advocacy groups that will consistently put pressure, and reaching out to communities and businesses and places that will express, and consistently voice their, that this is important and that this is a priority. I think that, in terms of the greater political scene, I think that maybe that's, one way to instead of lobbying necessarily directly the politicians themselves, maybe we also need to lobby the people with influence, the people with money, right? The companies and things like that. But I also think, in terms of more at a smaller scale system, like the administrators and things like that, it's really parents. In the school systems, parents are the biggest consumer. So they listen to parents. If parents consistently are pushing and aligning each other with, aligning to voice that these things are important. I think that's really where, a lot of they will listen more carefully, right? And I think consistently continuing to show up at school board meetings and to show up at SAC meetings in the schools and, to write to the president of the university and other administrators. I think that's really, one suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to have any closing remarks, anything that you want to say about the study itself, about the survivors themselves, about this issue. Dr. Craddock?
Sure. I was privileged to be part of it. The stories that were shared were brave. They showed such strength and resilience and perseverance. I don't know that I would have been as strong or persevering as they were. I was impressed with the way they've chosen to live their lives. I mean, some of them will have some long-term counseling issues for sure, but they're forging ahead and they're trying to build a good life, even in the fact of this horrific event that's in their rearview mirror, but still a critical part of their almost DNA makeup now. I mean, it changed who they were.
Yes.
And
Thank
I
you.
was so appreciative of the fact that they were willing to be a part of this study, because it does matter and it will make a difference.
Thank you. Dr. DelRio?
Yeah, I agree. I think I was so in awe of the participants and their willingness and their candor to share their story, even though at times it was painful to relive some of these, because at the end, and one of the things that I did see was a theme in all of the participants and that I, engaged with and I saw in when analyzing the data, is that they all are motivated to make a difference in a different way, in their own way. Some were joining the military, some wanted to be part of law enforcement, some of them wanted to go into supportive roles, some wanted to do education, but they all wanted to make a difference, to create change in some way.
Yes.
And I think that that was so inspiring, that their resilience to, supersede or to try to put that in a little box in a drawer and close that drawer for now, to forge ahead and say, yes, this happened to me, and now I want to make a difference.
Yes.
And I think that was just, huge.
Absolutely.
And I admire them for that.
Me too, 100%.
Yeah. And I want to just say a big shout out and a thank you to Madison Geller, Maddie. She was one of our students, one of our CJ grads, who I miss tremendously. And I want to thank her for all that she did with assisting us in this research. And from what I've heard from the grapevine of some of the participants, and this is a quote, to this day, I still have friends texting me saying how these interviews helped them because it was the first time somebody listened to them with the intent of doing good, rather than just being for a news article where they didn't actually care about the person. They just wanted the story. So, hearing that from one of our participants really makes me feel good about what we did and the research that we took, took place. So I just want to say, as we close tonight's conversation, thank you again, Dr. Maribel DelRio Roberts, Dr. Tina Craddock, for sharing such powerful insights. I also want to say a big thank you, shout out to others on the research team, Dr. Maria Levy-Minzy, Dr. Timothy Scala, Dr. Brooke Elvington, and Dr. Jennifer Allen. And mostly, thank you to the survivors, to the participants who shared so openly with us and honestly with us and made themselves vulnerable. The lived experiences of these survivors remind us that tragedy doesn't end when the cameras leave. The healing, the resilience, and the lessons learned continue for years and sometimes lifetimes. So thank you again to both of you, my colleagues. I honor you, I respect you, and I thank you for being with us tonight. And I want to say thank you to all of our viewers. Always thank you to Dean Durham. Thank you to Dr. Castro for being here. And thank you to all of our PhD candidates that are with us. Also, I hope that they got a little bit of a teaser here about qualitative research. And if you would join me next Thursday, October 16th, we're going to be looking at another study that we did, a grant that Dr. Maria Levy-Minzy and I and Dr. Jungerson and folks from the United Way of Broward County engaged in, and it was about the use of sociodrama on attitudes related to bullying of at-risk youth. And my two guests are going to be Dr. Jungerson, Tara Jungerson from the College of Psychology, and Miss Jenna Stein from the United Way of Broward County. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we're going to just keep on doing our research. Thank you all for watching tonight.